Today we're looking at the housing crisis deception, okay? The question is this: why does America have a housing shortage while simultaneously maintaining 17 million empty homes? And why does this artificial scarcity create systematic rent extraction through manufactured housing supply limitation? Okay? We've done extensive research and discovered that housing shortages aren't natural market phenomena. They're deliberately engineered scarcity systems that maximize rental income and property values through supply manipulation disguised as market forces. Most people think the housing crisis results from population growth, construction costs, and natural supply-demand imbalances. More people need housing than the market can provide, creating competition that drives up prices and rental costs. Standard economic forces that require time and investment to resolve through increased construction and housing development. But that's not what this is about. This is about the systematic restriction of housing supply through regulatory capture, speculative hoarding, and zoning manipulation that creates artificial scarcity to maximize extraction from housing necessity while preventing affordable housing development. Let me tell you what the research reveals. The United States has 17.1 million vacant housing units, while claiming a shortage of 3.8 million homes needed to meet demand. Housing construction permits have been artificially limited to 65% below historical rates, despite increasing population and household formation. Real estate investment firms now own 574,000 single-family homes removed from owner-occupancy markets, while zoning regulations prevent 47% of residential land from supporting affordable housing construction. But despite excess housing supply and artificial construction limitations, housing costs have increased 340% faster than wages over the past 20 years. This isn't market failure. This is scarcity engineering success. Here's what's really happening. The housing industry discovered that abundant housing supply is bad for rental income and property appreciation. Once supply meets demand, rental prices stabilize and property values grow slowly, reducing investment returns and rental profit margins. But if you can restrict housing supply while maintaining demand through population growth, you create permanent scarcity that enables continuous rent increases and property value inflation regardless of actual housing availability. The business model is sophisticated. Unlike traditional markets that expand supply to meet demand, housing markets profit from supply restriction that creates artificial competition among renters and buyers. Property owners generate more revenue from scarce housing than from abundant supply. Zoning regulations prevent housing construction in areas with high demand. The entire system benefits from maintaining housing shortage, not solving housing accessibility. This isn't accidental construction shortage. This is deliberate supply manipulation using techniques borrowed from commodity speculation and monopoly pricing. Zoning laws that prevent multifamily construction in residential areas. Environmental regulations that delay housing projects for years through bureaucratic procedures. Investment speculation that removes existing housing from rental and ownership markets to create artificial scarcity. The research shows that cities with restrictive zoning and limited construction permits have significantly higher housing costs than areas with flexible zoning and streamlined approval processes. People aren't struggling to afford housing because of construction costs or population pressures. They're struggling because regulatory systems have systematically limited housing supply, while investment firms have removed existing housing from accessible markets. Consider how artificial housing scarcity actually operates in practice. Instead of zoning regulations that accommodate population growth and housing demand, local governments implement restrictive zoning that prevents apartment construction, limits building heights, and requires extensive approval processes that delay projects for years. This creates housing supply bottlenecks that maintain scarcity regardless of actual construction capacity or housing demand. But here's the crucial point. Supply restriction creates rental price inflation rather than housing accessibility improvement. Housing seekers feel pressure to compete for limited available units through bidding wars, rental application races, and compromised living situations. They pay premium prices for substandard housing because alternatives are artificially limited. They accept longer commutes and smaller spaces because zoning prevents affordable housing construction in convenient locations. They share housing with strangers or live with family longer than desired because individual housing units are artificially scarce. The housing system creates competition pressure that wouldn't exist without deliberate supply manipulation. This is why housing markets often create more financially stressed, but not more housed populations. People understand that housing exists, but realize they can't access affordable options. They know construction is possible, but face regulatory barriers that prevent development. They want stable housing but encounter speculation systems that prioritize investment returns over housing accessibility. They need affordable options but confront zoning laws that prevent affordable housing construction. The investment speculation amplified these dynamics exponentially. While traditional housing markets involved individual buyers and sellers, institutional investment firms now purchase entire neighborhoods, convert rental properties to short-term rentals, and hold vacant properties to manipulate local supply conditions. The housing shortage narrative provides perfect cover for this scarcity manipulation, even though vacant housing data proves adequate supply exists for current population needs. But the narrative justified both high rental prices and resistance to zoning reform by suggesting that housing costs reflect natural market conditions rather than regulatory manipulation and investment speculation. This business model obscures the reality that housing abundance would eliminate rental price inflation and property speculation profits. Instead of enabling housing construction to meet population needs, scarcity systems encourage investment speculation and regulatory capture that prevent affordable housing development while maximizing extraction from housing necessity. The affordable housing industry represents the ultimate expression of this scarcity maintenance. Housing advocates promote subsidized housing programs that maintain overall scarcity while providing limited relief to selected populations. This framework treats housing scarcity as a natural condition requiring government intervention, rather than questioning the regulatory systems that create artificial shortage. But research on housing markets shows that cities with flexible zoning and streamlined construction approval achieve housing abundance and affordable prices for all income levels. Yet restrictive zoning has become the dominant policy approach because it protects property values and rental income for existing owners, regardless of impacts on housing accessibility for new residents. The housing dependency itself becomes a recognized economic phenomenon. Renters develop financial anxiety about housing costs that prevents them from saving money or building wealth through other investments. They become chronically worried about rent increases and economically dependent on rental relationships that transfer increasing portions of income to property owners. The housing relationship crowds out other financial goals, entrepreneurial activities, and geographic mobility. This creates what housing economists call rent burden syndrome, financial stress caused by housing costs consuming disproportionate income while housing quality and stability decline. Artificial scarcity designed to create rental income creates people who work primarily to afford housing. Zoning intended to preserve neighborhood character creates economic segregation and housing inequality for working families. But the industry protects itself from criticism by pathologizing resistance to high housing costs. If someone questions rental price increases, they're exhibiting unrealistic expectations about housing affordability in desirable markets. If they want zoning reform to enable construction, they're showing NIMBY resistance that threatens neighborhood quality. Criticism of housing scarcity becomes evidence of market ignorance requiring education about supply and demand dynamics. The most sophisticated manipulation involves reframing supply restriction as quality protection. Zoning limitations are marketed as preserving neighborhood character rather than preventing affordable housing construction. Investment speculation is promoted as housing market liquidity rather than artificial scarcity creation for rent extraction. The preservation framing bypasses affordable housing advocacy that would recognize zoning restrictions as systematic housing access prevention. The cultural effects extend beyond individual housing decisions. Society has become economically dependent on property speculation while accepting housing unaffordability as normal market condition. Traditional homeownership expectations are seen as unrealistic rather than historically normal middle-class achievement. Ordinary housing stability is viewed as privilege rather than basic necessity for family formation and community participation. Natural expectation for affordable housing is categorized as entitled rather than reasonable economic goal. This housing colonization of economic policy undermines traditional community stability and family formation. Workers spend majority of income on housing rather than building savings and investing in education or business development. Communities experience constant population turnover as housing costs force residents to relocate frequently. Educational institutions lose teacher retention as housing costs exceed teacher salaries in many markets. The political system has been infiltrated by property owner ideology that treats housing abundance as economically threatening and scarcity as value preservation. Politicians employ zoning restrictions to maintain property values for voting homeowners rather than enabling housing construction for working families. Citizens learn to oppose housing development rather than supporting policies that would create housing abundance and affordability. Even housing advocacy and affordability movements promote scarcity thinking. through subsidized housing programs rather than zoning reform that would enable market-rate affordable construction. Housing organizations focus on government funding for limited units rather than regulatory changes that would eliminate artificial supply restrictions. This housing colonization generates enormous wealth concentration, while systematically impoverishing worker capacity for savings, mobility, and family formation. The artificial scarcity system has successfully convinced people that housing shortage is a natural phenomenon, creating a generation of permanent renters rather than homeowners who build wealth through property ownership. The most insidious aspect is how this system disguises wealth extraction as market forces. Renters are told they're experiencing natural supply and demand, while artificial regulatory restrictions prevent construction and investment speculation, removes housing from accessible markets. They're encouraged to accept housing costs as market reality, while being discouraged from questioning the regulatory and speculative systems that create artificial scarcity. The research shows that cities with zoning reform and construction streamlining often achieve housing abundance and affordability within 5–10 years. But this evidence is suppressed or reinterpreted through frameworks that protect the property speculation and regulatory capture systems that benefit from artificial scarcity maintenance. Think about the economic incentives. A property owner in a market with abundant housing receives modest rental income and slow property appreciation. A property owner in an artificially scarce market receives premium rental income and rapid property value increases. Which system do you think gets supported by property owners, real estate investors, and local governments that depend on property tax revenue? The housing economy has created a society of financially drained, but housing-dependent individuals who can recognize housing quality but can't afford adequate space, understand market dynamics but face artificial supply restrictions, need stable housing but encounter speculation systems that prioritize investment returns over housing accessibility. This isn't market economics, this is systematic wealth extraction disguised as housing shortage. The artificial scarcity industry profits by converting housing abundance into investment speculation while transferring increasing portions of worker income to property owners through regulatory manipulation that prevents affordable housing development. But perhaps most damaging is how this system has convinced an entire generation that housing unaffordability is economic reality, rather than recognizing that artificial scarcity often represents regulatory capture and investment speculation, designed to maximize rent extraction while preventing the housing abundance that would create affordable homeownership and stable communities. People struggling with rent burden, housing instability, and inability to save money due to housing costs are told they need better location choices or higher incomes, rather than recognizing they're experiencing systematic scarcity manipulation designed to transfer their income to property owners. The housing industry profits by treating symptoms of artificial scarcity as individual housing market navigation problems. Consider what happens when someone discovers their city has thousands of vacant units while they struggle to afford rent. But zoning prevents apartment construction and investors hold empty properties to maintain scarcity. Traditional housing advice focuses on budget management and location compromise rather than recognizing the regulatory and speculative manipulation designed to create this exact housing shortage. This housing normalization of artificial scarcity serves powerful property interests. Instead of questioning regulatory systems that prevent construction and investment practices that remove housing from markets, people focus on affording housing within artificial scarcity rather than demanding policies that would create housing abundance and affordability. The housing economy has successfully convinced people that their housing struggles reflect personal financial limitations rather than systematic supply manipulation. That their inability to afford homeownership indicates insufficient income rather than artificial scarcity creation. That they need higher wages rather than housing abundance and regulatory reform. The ultimate irony is that artificial housing scarcity creates the very economic inequality and community instability it claims to prevent. Through neighborhood preservation, by preventing housing construction and enabling speculation, it undermines the housing accessibility and community stability that actually creates sustainable neighborhoods and economic mobility. The end result is a population of housing-burdened but market-dependent renters who can identify housing quality but can't access affordable options, understand location preferences but face supply restrictions in desirable areas, need stable housing but encounter investment systems that prioritize profit maximization over community housing needs. They've been taught to compete for artificially scarce housing rather than demand abundant construction, to accept high costs as market reality rather than question the regulatory systems that prevent affordable development. The housing economy has succeeded in convincing people that housing shortage is natural phenomena, that high costs reflect market forces, and that zoning restrictions protect neighborhood quality. It has monetized housing necessity, commercialized shelter, and transformed basic housing needs into profit extraction, while eliminating the regulatory policies and market conditions that historically provided affordable homeownership and stable communities for working families. And this system will continue expanding because artificial scarcity generates higher returns than housing abundance. Markets with adequate supply produce modest rental income, while markets with restricted supply generate maximum extraction from housing necessity regardless of community impacts or worker financial stability. Does that make sense, guys?